The wind that swept across the frozen steppes in the winter of 1942 carried more than just the razor-sharp ice of Siberia. It carried a whisper of death that no general, however decorated, dared to utter aloud. There was a heavy silence in the concrete bunkers, a silence that preceded the scratching of pens over maps stained with blood and ash. In that moment, the war had ceased to be a matter of territorial conquest and had become an anatomy of the human soul under absolute pressure. The uniforms, once pristine symbols of an unshakable order, were now worn thin, coated in the soot of cities that refused to die. And at the center of this whirlwind of steel and despair, a directive emerged from the depths of Central Commander. Sentence written with the coldness of one who has never felt the frozen metal of a rifle against his cheek. The order that no soldier wanted to obey but every soldier would have to fulfill. It was not merely a tactical instruction or a shift in frontline positioning. It was the severing of the last thread of humanity remaining between the high command and the combatant. The sound of boots marching over hardened snow created a hypnotic rhythm, a somber metronome for men who knew their next step would lead not to glory, but to the abyss. The lights of distant cities were nothing more than orange glares on the horizon, marking where the world was being dismantled brick by brick. The artillery, in its constant symphony of artificial thunder, no longer sought merely to destroy the enemy, but to silence the doubt growing in the chest of every youth sent to the front lines. They looked at one another, eyes hollowed, skinned leathery from the frost, and saw the reflection of a destiny that no longer belonged to them. The orders arrived in sealed envelopes, delivered by couriers who avoided eye contact. When the words were read, the air inside the tent seemed to grow even thinner. They spoke of total resistance, of not retreating a single millimeter, even as the earth itself liquefied under fire. They spoke of turning every house, every cellar, and every pile of rubble into a shared tomb. The soldier, who once dreamed of returning home, now realized his name had already been struck from the list of the living by his own superiors. Betrayal did not come from the enemy across no man's land, but from the pens of those dining at oak tables while the world outside smelled of sulfur and charred flesh. The command was clear, not one step back. A short phrase, almost poetic in its brutality, which transformed strategic withdrawal into high treason and the preservation of life into unpardonable cowardice. Those who hesitated before the advancing tank columns would find the muzzles of their own compatriots' guns pressed against their backs. It was death from the front or execution from behind. The battlefield became a prison without walls, where the horizon was the firing squad S-line, and the sky gray and indifferent the only witness to a sacrifice that history, its haste to celebrate victors, often prefers to sanitize. Slowly, the reality of that order began to seep into the trenches like an invisible gas. Fear, once directed at the invader, turned into internal paranoia. Childhood friends who shared their last piece of dry bread now watched one another for signs of weakness, of surrender, of humanity. The sound of a bullet being chambered in the shadows of the rear was more terrifying than the roar of enemy mortar. The order demanded the soldier cease to be a man and become a bulkhead of flesh, and they obeyed. They obeyed with the automation of the condemned, with the strength of those who have nothing left to lose because their tomorrow had been confiscated by the state. In the ruins of a tractor factory, where twisted metal looked like the claws of prehistoric monsters, a young sergeant clutched a hidden rosary in his pocket as he heard the command repeated over the radio. He looked at his men boys who still had the softness of youth hidden under layers of filth. They all knew the position was untenable, that the encirclement was closing, and that military logic dictated a withdrawal to save what remained of the regiment. But logic had been declared illegal. The order demanded the impossible, and the impossible would be delivered with the blood of an entire generation. The battle was no longer made of grand maneuvers on a map, but of centimeters won at the cost of hundreds of lives. Every step of a staircase in a ruined building was a battlefield. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the sickly sweet scent of decomposition that the cold could no longer mask. Silence, when it came, was worse than the noise. It was the silence of those waiting for the signal for the end. And when the signal came, the sharp blast of a whistle, the hoarse shout of a commissar, they threw themselves against the steel, not out of heroism, but because the order had removed every other exit. It was the triumph of will over survival, a perversion of leadership that turned duty into a collective suicide pact. As night fell over the Volga, and the river's waters carried the wreckage of a civilization that once prided itself on culture, the scale of the disaster became tangible. Thousands of men were trapped between the ice and the fury. Hunger began to gnaw at what remained of discipline, but the order remained there, unshakable, like a stone idol demanding more offerings. Generals who once paraded in Berlin or Moscow now trembled at the telephone, knowing their inability to achieve the unrealizable would be punished with the same cruelty they imposed on their subordinates. War had become a black mirror, reflecting the worst of human nature, the inability to admit error, and the ease of sacrificing the other in the name of power. The accounts that survived those days speak of hollow stares, of men who continued to fire even after being hit, moved by an impulse that was no longer conscious. It was absolute obedience, born from the deepest despair. When the ammunition supply ran dry, they used stones in their bare hands. When the frost froze the mechanisms of their weapons, they used bayonets and knives. The order had been fulfilled. The land was not yielded, but the price was the soul of those who defended it. Victory, if one can call the remains of a graveyard such a thing, tasted of ashes. In the end, when the cannons finally fell silent and the smoke began to clear, what remained were not the names of the strategists who wrote the orders, but the frozen footprints of men who marched into nothingness. The snow, with its indifferent whiteness, began to cover the bodies, leveling generals and privates, heroes and deserters, into a single shroud of oblivion. The order no soldier wanted to obey became the epitaph for millions. And in the decades that followed, the world would look back trying to understand how the human heart could endure such weight without realizing that the true horror was not in the battle itself, but in the silent acceptance that a man's life is worth less than a line drawn on a map by hands that never felt the cold of death. The echo of that last stand still resonates in the stones of rebuilt cities, a somber reminder that power, when stripped of compassion, creates only monumental ruins. History teaches us that extreme sacrifice is often just the mask of a catastrophic failure of leadership. And as the wind continues to blow over the plains where iron once collided with flesh, the question remains, suspended in time. How far will a man go to fulfill what he knows to be his end? The answer is written in the silence of lost archives and in the petrified gaze of those who saw hell and were not permitted to look away. The war ended not with a cry of triumph, but with a long sigh of a humanity exhausted by itself. And on those invisible frontiers, where a superior's command met a soldier's last breath, remained the lesson that time insists on repeating. The greatest secret of a war is not how it is won, but how the men who fight it manage to keep the light of conscience burning when everything around them conspires to put it out. The snow is now eternal over the battlefields, hiding the secrets of those who obeyed until the end, leaving us only with the duty to remember that behind every statistic, there was a heart that beat strong before being silenced by a decree.